Welcome to Friends in Faith. We continue with Hard Sayings by Trent Horn. And this week we're going to go over conflicting advice. When I got into the seminary and finally got into theology, and we studied fundamental theology. And fundamental theology went over all of what we believe, basically the creed, and all our basic teachings. And it's fascinating because nothing is contradictory. Everything is clear and concise, and you go over. And as you go over, you will have references, all these biblical references to everything. But when you go and you then go into the Synoptic Gospels, or St. John, or Old Testament, wisdom liturgy, you find out that sacred scripture is not a fundamental class on theology. We believe this because of this, 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 and then we believe this. No. And we can get into real trouble by taking scripture out of context or too literally. Okay? So I'd like to talk about that for a few minutes, because so many times, whether when I was a chaplain to a high school, and kids would come up and say, "Father, I've decided I don't believe anymore because I have found contradictions in the Bible." I go, "Oh, okay." And I'd sit down with them and go over the contradictions. And the first thing was, who is this being written for? Is it Old Testament, New Testament? In the Old Testament, how far back does it go? Well, it seems to think that Job doesn't believe in heaven. Well, Job was one of the earliest scriptures. And scripture takes the truths, and little by little it is a growing revelation to Israel. So the whole theology behind Job is not trying to answer a question, does heaven exist or not? No. It's really that we've come into the world naked, we will go out of the world naked. Everything we have is a gift from God. There's many other things it's trying to teach, but it's not attempting even to go there. And yet we go, oh, there's a line here, a line there. It seems to say heaven does not exist. Well, as a matter of fact, in the Old Testament, it's only towards the end of the Old Testament that we develop a real understanding of our afterlife. And so the first thing is, who is all of this literature geared towards? And were there specific situations that they're trying to address? We have to put sacred scripture in context. The next thing is the general truths that are being taught. And a lot of times they're general truths, they're not specific truths. For example, happy the man who does X, Y, and Z. Well, I know somebody who did X, Y, and Z and they weren't happy. Okay. In general, if somebody does X, Y, and Z, they're going to be filled with peace. They're going to be filled with happiness. Because doing this generally always leads to happiness. It is God teaching us that this is the road to happiness, but it does not say that every single person who does this is going to be necessarily happy. And the same goes, the evil will be punished. Well, I know a whole bunch of evil people who seem to be extremely happy. Okay. And yet, we've got to be really careful, because let's define happiness. Let's define somebody who is evil. Are they going to really be at peace? They might enjoy themselves. But how many people we see that seem to have everything, and then they finally commit suicide. They don't have purpose or fulfillment. And so Scripture is trying to say the road to evil never satisfies. Same thing that Christ says, right? The road to evil never satisfies. But if we try to take a specific, go, this person, Hugh Hefner, seemed to be very happy. Well, he seemed to be, but if you talk to people who were really close to Hugh Hefner, they'll tell you he was a very depressed, unhappy man. He never, ever got the satisfaction he was looking for. And his whole life can be seen as a tragedy. So, what is the general thing that we're trying to do? And there are specifics that are going to seemingly contradict, but we got to be really careful with that. The second thing is hyperbole. There are genres in sacred scripture. Sacred scripture is trying to tell the truth. And when it says, for example, that everyone from Jerusalem and Judea went to get baptized, is it literally trying to say that? No, because there are expressions that belong to a specific time that everybody went. Well, means a heck of a lot of people went. We can't take that literally. Those are sayings, hyperbole, trying to get across an image, an idea, which is a truth. It's absolutely true that a tremendous amount of people went to get baptized by John the Baptist. Absolutely. We have other sources that talk about the crowds that went from Jerusalem to get baptized. So, what is the truth? We can't take every line literally, or we get into trouble. And again, they're not trying to teach about science. The mustard seed is the smallest of all seeds. We discovered that it wasn't. No. Christ is talking to a group of people who, in Israel at that time, the mustard seed was known as the smallest. But he's not making a scientific claim. He is using this as an image and saying, look, this is so small, and see how big it grows. He's teaching about faith. He's not teaching about botany. He's not teaching about science. So we can't get upset when somebody says, there's a seed that's smaller than that. Well, and this is not a scientific journal here. And we have to truly say, what are these passages trying to teach? Also, we have to understand that these truths that are being taught, like, what does it take to get to heaven? Okay? And when Jesus says, you need to have faith, if you have faith, you will get to heaven. There's also, he says, if you do X, Y, and Z, you'll get to heaven. Like, all of these things you need to do. And all of a sudden you go, well, who's right, the Catholics or the Protestants? That it's by faith that we're justified, or is it by our acts that we're justified? Well, we can find scripture on both ends. But St. James says, faith without scripture, or acts, doing things without faith and faith without doing things, both are empty. And so, in these passages, there are these truths that are absolute truths. We're justified by our faith, and our faith demands actions. They're both true. Scripture is not a book of fundamental theology. And every passage has its truth that has to be opened in our heart, and we have to believe. But they don't necessarily contradict each other. Because when we get into good works without faith, faith without works, and it says something over here which contradicts something over there, well, you know something? Over and over and over again, they seem to contradict, but they don't. Because they're talking about things that are true about ourselves and about God. And when we look at the whole of Scripture and we put it into a context of the entire Scripture and not just one line, we are going to be okay. Scripture needs to be taken as a whole. And when we only take one phrase and we take that out of context, and we can create a whole religion out of it. And we look at the Jehovah's Witnesses and some of things like that, and you see how they've based so much of their teaching out of context, we get into real trouble. And so let us look at Scripture as a whole and these truths as part of the whole. And you'll find that it doesn't contradict. So let us talk about these things. And again, if you want to give comments to these, if you're seeing this on YouTube, we'd love to have your comments. So we encourage that. And have a good discussion on these things. What are the things you think are contradictory? And let's talk it over. Let's talk it through, because Scripture is from God, but it's not about contradicting it, because truth is one, and there shouldn't be these contradictions. God bless, and hope you've enjoyed this session.